Temos a satisfação de receber o professor Roger Keil, da York University do Canadá, que é já um parceiro da casa, já tem trabalhado e vem hoje apresentar um pouco de alguns resultados de uma pesquisa que ele vem desenvolvendo e que tem professores da universidade da casa que são parceiros dessa pesquisa. Veio através de uma cátedra do IEAT e vai nos participar hoje com essa palestra aqui hoje para a gente. E eu convido o professor João Tonucci para fazer uma breve introdução, uma apresentação do nosso convidado aqui hoje. Excuse me, I was just speaking in Portuguese for them, and then I'll... João.
Ok, obrigado, Bernardo. I was speaking Portuguese for now, ok, Roger? But, boa tarde, pessoal. Obrigado pela presença. A gente está honrado aqui de receber novamente o professor Roger Keil. Ele é professor na Faculty of Environment and Urban Change, da York University em Toronto. O professor Keil pesquisa suburbanização global, que é um dos temas que ele vai falar aqui hoje para a gente, ecologia política urbana, cidades, doenças infecciosas, infraestrutura e governança regional. Ele tem uma série de publicações, os últimos livros, Suburban Planet, em 2018, After Suburbia, que saiu ano passado, e Pandemic Urbanism, estudando os impactos da Covid nas cidades do mundo. O professor Keil, a gente tem colaborado já há alguns anos, ele esteve aqui, nós co-organizamos um evento que é parte desse projeto de pesquisa que ele vai apresentar hoje, em 2016. Então, we are very pleased and honored to have you back here, Roger. And eu gostaria apenas de lembrar vocês que o professor está aqui como convidado do IEAT. Quem não conhece o IEAT é um instituto de estudos transdisciplinares da UFMG, e ele vai estar aqui durante mais 2 semanas, e a gente tem uma série de outras programações. Eu enviei por e-mail, vocês devem ter visto. Então, estão convidados também a participar das 2 conferências que vão acontecer na semana que vem. Uma aqui, que vai ser a conferência geral do IEAT, e a outra no Instituto de Geociências, nosso vizinho aqui, sobre ecologia política urbana. Okay? Thank you, Roger, again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, João and Bernardo, for the introduction. Today, I want to thank you for the invitation to come here and to speak to you today. And I want to apologize. Normally, I would like to stand and be able to talk to you standing up, but I did break my ankle 2 months ago, and to stand for an hour is a bit difficult. So I'm sitting here, and I'm looking at my computer, the slides, so I don't have to turn around. I know actually what's going on. So if I make some strange movements, it's only because of my current disability in that regard. So let me quickly open this up. So what you see behind me, and I was here 7 years ago now, 6 or 7 years ago. We had a workshop of a project that I was the director of at York University, but it involved 50 people around the world, and our colleagues here participated and organized the workshop with us and participated in the production of a large outcome of research on global suburbanization, which took us almost 10 years, started in 2010, ended in 2019, just before the pandemic. And what you will hear from me today is sort of a look back at what we found collectively and a look forward in terms of where are we going with this idea of global suburbanization, and as we often say, global suburbanisms, which is suburban ways of life. So these are some of the books that we produced early on in the pandemic. And there's a book series by the name Global Suburbanisms. Here are some of the titles in that series if you're interested in particular aspects of suburbanization. Many of them are edited books, but also they're monographs now. And I say it here because I say it everywhere. If you are somebody who has a piece of work in the works on suburbanization. If you're writing a dissertation, or if you're writing a book, this is one series you might consider. Now we have 11 or 12 volumes in the series. There's one here which is particularly relevant to people in this region on the left, beyond the megacity, which Professor Tonucci has an article in, a chapter in. So we're continuing to produce regional volumes on suburbanization, empirical work, but also conceptual work, because as you can imagine, if I just go back quickly here, the one on the left is what's in a name. It's just about how suburbs are even named, how we refer in different languages to suburbanization or extended urbanization. In my own language, in German, when I go to Germany and I say, you guys have suburbs, they say, no, we don't have suburbs, only Americans have suburbs. And which is, of course, not true. And I grew up in a suburb outside of Frankfurt. I could show you images of it. Looks just like in the United States. It's just a different type of suburbanization. But so it exists, and I'll make the case today in what I will show you in the next 40 minutes. I'll show you a bit about beyond the name, beyond the idiosyncrasies, the differences that we see around the globe, some of the commonalities of global suburbanization. So I'll take you first on a trip around the world, and that by total coincidence, in the year before the pandemic, my last big trip was the biggest trip I've taken in my life. It's a trip of a lifetime. I flew once around the world. I started in Toronto, and I had to go to a conference in Africa, and later, a week later, I had to go to Australia for a visit, just like the visit I'm having here in Belo Horizonte. And so I didn't want to fly from Toronto to Africa and then back to Toronto and then to Australia. So I kept on flying, and the airlines offered an around-the-world ticket at a very affordable price. So for the first time in my life, I flew around the world like Jules Verne in the 19th century. So here you see, of course, the iconic map of urbanization in the world right now, a majority urban world. But I will make the case that that majority urban world is actually a majority suburban world. It's a world of extended urbanization. So I started out in Canada, typical North American suburbanization for your benefit as people living in a southern climate. I have some snow for you here. This is what we have, 5 months of the year. It's an important aspect, climatology, the questions about climate and local conditions. But as you will see, the kinds of urban forms and suburban forms that we have developed around the globe often resemble themselves despite those differences. So I'm leaving here to go to Africa, as I said, and here's a heat map of urbanization. Oops, sorry, see that I was going to get. So this, you probably didn't see this. This is Mississauga, the snow. The heat map of urbanization in Africa. And I'm going to the Great Lakes region, to Kampala, Uganda, where the conference is. And you can see in the eastern part of the continent, there is a lot of urbanization happening. But it's an extended form of urbanization. Later, and when I have another lecture next week in which I talk about infectious disease and pandemics related to this extended urbanization, I will talk, amongst other things, about West Africa, and you can see how extensive the urbanization in West Africa is. But I'm not landing in the West, I'm landing in the East, in Kampala, Uganda, and here you see the typical forms of urbanization. And I'm landing in Entebbe, which is, I think the airport is about 20 kilometers away from Kampala. And I drive along this new highway, which is taking me through square kilometers and square kilometers of this type of urbanization. It's not in a finished state. Often it's 1-story, 2-story, people add to it. But it's a form that is not classical urbanization. It's not the kind of urbanization that we have in our textbooks of, Manchester, Barcelona, New York City, the kinds of cities, Chicago, cities that we learn about in urban studies, in planning. It is a new form of urbanization, which not only you find in Uganda, but in other parts of the world. And it comes with an infrastructure, with this new and now privatized tall highway built by Chinese companies with Chinese capital. And around this highway infrastructure, here you see the building, you see the advertising for the kinds of landscapes that are being produced. They could be anywhere in the world because it is not just the suburban housing that I showed you on the first image, but it's also, of course, everything that comes with it. The schools, the hospitals, the shopping malls. And it comes with certain technologies. Here you see, again, owned by a Chinese company, a form of modular housing. So a suburban form of housing in which you can buy the materials and either self-build or have your housing built alongside this new road. So it's an entire complex development that is being put together here. And I should also perhaps let you know that, of course, it comes with a particular form of consumption, right? So you have the chain stores. In this case, it's a company called Café Javas, which is like a Starbucks kind of company, which is part of that suburban expansion, which is we're all now used to wherever we go in the world. We can rely on the fact that we find these kinds of companies providing us with coffee, drinks, fast food. We are used to it wherever we go. This is becoming part of the sub/urban world in which we live. So now I'm leaving Kampala out of Entebbe Airport. You can see the informal settlement, which also from a previous era existing here. These are mixed environments, which is not just residential. You have workshops, working environments, and so on. And we are coming to Johannesburg in South Africa. Again, a form of suburban development. Most likely this is a township of the apartheid era. From the kind of form I would assume it is. And then you have a particular form of urbanization or suburbanization, which is different in colonial Uganda from apartheid South Africa on the same continent. Similar kinds of informalities, but of course a different kinds of history. And, I'm leaving immediately. I only stop over in Johannesburg. I go to Perth, which is on the western edge of Australia. And Australia has the reputation of being the most suburban country in the world. And most people live in these kinds of environments, single-family homes in very automobile-oriented suburban environments. So I spent a couple of weeks there on my visiting professorship, and then I have to get out again, and since I'm flying with one particular airline, I have to leave through New Zealand because they don't have any other stopovers in Australia, so I fly directly from Perth to New Zealand. I get a one-day stay in New Zealand. One time only I've been to New Zealand, but I get a suburban picture out of it, right? So this is now another country, yet another type of suburbanization, and I enter the North American, it's not really the continent, but the North American airspace in Honolulu, Hawaii, where I meet my daughter who has a visiting studentship there at the university. And then I fly home again to Mississauga. And so I can run around the world, and I've seen very similar but also very different types of suburban development around the globe. And then for like 3 or 4 years, we didn't travel anywhere. There was a pandemic, and so I only recently took up traveling again. And I was in the winter, I was in Tampere in Finland, where I am an advisor on a suburban research project. And again, similar kinds of, this is the outside of the city of Tampere, the old industrial city of Tampere, a satellite pod in the middle of the forest built in the 1970s, which now needs repair, it needs refurbishment. I can show you these kinds of suburbs all over Europe, all over Eastern Europe, all over Canada. It's a very typical form of this kind of development. And then even more recently on the left, a city of 1 million people that looks like that, it's Bushbuck Ridge in South Africa, close to the Mozambican border. I took that out of a driving car. I wasn't driving, I was a passenger. And then last week I went to an urban studies conference before I came here in Nashville, Tennessee in the United States. Again, I took a picture, another form of extended urbanization, dispersed urbanization, suburbanization. Of course, you wouldn't be surprised to find that in the United States because, as I said in the beginning, most would, I assume, not only my compatriots in Germany, but most people would assume that suburbs you find in the United States or in Canada, Australia, in the Anglosphere, and I'm talking more about this. But the point I wanted to make is that you find it everywhere, and you also find it here. So the last time I was here, João and his colleagues took me to Nova Lima, and very similar types of forms of suburbanization, both in a high-rise format, but also behind the high-rise buildings, very posh, Beverly Hills-looking types of suburbs that are modeled after, I assume, to some degree, after the North American model. And back to Mississauga. Here on this image you see on the ground now, not from the air anymore, the two types, the archetype of suburbanization, which I will spend a little bit more time on in a minute, that have to do with, on the one hand, high-rise development, often in concentrated form, as you see on the left. These towers are in a city of 800,000 people, which is one of Canada's largest suburbs. They won an architectural prize. They are called the Marilyn Monroe Towers, believe me or not. And then the typical bungalow, ranch-style suburban development that you find in every American movie, with driveways and 2-car garages or 3-car garages. The typical idea of what suburbia stands for. But don't forget what I'm showing you on the left, because this is now perhaps the most pervasive form of development. And then there are, so these are the private suburbs. This is where people live. But then you also have the public suburbs. This is a city hall of that suburban town, Mississauga. So there's an architecture of spectacle to some degree that you find now outside of, not only in the residential architecture with the Marilyn Monroe Towers, but also, of course, in the public architecture. You find a certain spectacle in suburbia. It's not a boring place anymore. You find people celebrate these kinds of spaces. And of course, you have the new economy, the global economy residing in suburbia. This is a warehouse outside of Toronto. There are dozens, hundreds of these kinds of sites now around our cities. And I haven't been around Belo Horizonte yet because I just arrived a couple of days ago. But I'm sure I will find the same kind of warehouse landscape also here. And of course, we now, after having been locked down and been at home and having stuff delivered to us by Amazon and other e-commerce providers, this kind of landscape has now become a pervasive space not only of commerce and consumption, but also of production. And again, when I speak in one of my lectures next week about the relationship of infectious disease and suburbanization, I will spend a lot of time on these kinds of new economies because they became the hotspots of many infections in many parts of the world. But I will not get into this right now. So, what we can conclude from this sort of empirical trip around the world is that we can say, well, we live in something that we can call the age of the urban periphery. Because you've heard probably that people say we live in the urban age. the age of urbanization. Since 2006, the majority of humans on the planet are living in some kind of environment that we could recognize as urban. But perhaps we need to think of that as a suburban or a peripheral place. So when we look at that now in more conceptual way or in an analytical way, not empirically me taking you to show you images from around the suburbs, there may be 4 points to consider. So what is new? Why am I spending so much time thinking about this? And what is it that we need to remember? The first thing that I don't need to elaborate on anymore because I took you around the world is that the size and scale of suburban development is absolutely new. We've had urbanization in Europe and parts of North America and other parts of the world. In the 19th century, industrial-based urbanization. We had urbanization in the second half of the 20th century that was often only suburbanization and automobile-based suburbanization. But now we have a pervasive new scale, a new size of urbanization around the world. That's the one point. The second point, similarly, is that it's pervasive. It's everywhere. And it's potentially damaging to our global ecology. So in the other lecture I give next week, I will specifically talk, and that's why I'm not going to get into this now, I'm going to specifically talk about that aspect of what does urbanization do to the natural environment. Importantly now, almost everywhere in the world, the third point, urbanization leads to an urban area growing faster than the urban population. Right? It's not the same rate of growth. We take up more space for fewer people. And that again is true everywhere in the world. It doesn't matter whether it's an informal settlement in Africa or a high-rise modern development in China. We are over time developing in a more sprawling fashion. And lastly, again, and you might have seen this in those images I showed you from the trip around the world, is that suburbanization in the 21st century now takes place in areas that have never seen urbanization before. Right? Because suburbanization logically is the spread around existing cities. But now we have dispersed form of urbanization in areas that have never seen urbanization before. Clemens and I talked at the outset about mining areas in Canada and Brazil. Where a new oil field is discovered or a new mine is being developed, you will immediately have a settlement around it. And that settlement is part of that worldwide sprawl and spread of urbanization. And there doesn't need to be a city center there before from which it sprawls. It immediately has that other form that we now see as typical for the age. So, this is the title of the talk after Suburbia, but also the title of our newest book from that series. And we look back and we think about, what have we learned? But at the same time, we call it after Suburbia, saying that perhaps the forms of explanation that we've had to understand suburbanization or suburbanisms as ways of life out of the 20th century are not enough to understand what's going on. So where do we go from here? Which is why I'm not now going to talk about. So number one, urbanization is suburbanization, and then suburban ways of life develop that may have similarities with what we have as urban sociologists or geographers or anthropologists called urban ways of life for 100 years now and more. But we now need to think differently about how we develop new forms of life that are particular to these new forms of development. And the e-commerce development is already one of those things. We don't go to shops anymore, we order things. But we also move around, our mobility patterns change. And when we are moving to a more electric form of mobility, e-mobility, then we will probably see yet another form of interaction of our life, our lifestyles, the rhythms of our life. Or lastly, consider what happened during the pandemic, that many of us had the privilege of working from home. Many of us who had that privilege have not returned to the office. So we are beginning to think differently about the relationship of the home and the workplace. And that is all part of that development after suburbia. So what we can say in summary about this is that the new and urban forms and ways of life, they are extended, they are fragmented, and they are central at the same time. And that's a bit of a paradox, because I've been talking to you about the growth of more extended forms and dispersed forms of urbanization. But everywhere we go, we see new centralities. I have a few examples for that in a minute. This happens at a time, this huge expansion, when the suburbs in the profession of urban planning and urbanism are unfashionable. Planners don't like suburbs. Urbanists don't like suburbs. They speak against it. Normatively, they want compact cities. They want density. They want pedestrian orientation. They want us not to use the automobile, right? So suburbs are right now difficult to defend as an urban form. And I'm, by the way, not defending them. I'm talking about them as a fact. But I'm not here to sell the suburbs, right? To be absolutely clear. Sometimes I'm being misunderstood, because I'm enthusiastic about what I study. People mistake that enthusiasm for wanting to sell the suburbs as a form of life. I'm not. I also like compact, livable, walkable environments. That's not the point. But here are some of the points that make the suburbs unattractive. They're economically unattractive. They are difficult to reach or difficult to get out of. They have no future for business. And this is one of those points where we now need to reconsider. Because remember, for those of you who are in sort of urban economics or urban studies, you have heard of somebody like Richard Florida, who has presented arguments for and about the creative city. That in order for us to be productive and creative, we need to rub shoulders in cafes where other creatives are. We have to have amenities where we can live urban lives, right? All of that has been called into question now, of course, because all of us have found it quite comfortable to work at our desk at home. Not rub shoulder with anybody except on Zoom, right? So we need to think differently about this now. But for a long time, people said, we can't have a creative economy if we have a suburban form of urbanization. And people voted with their feet. The millennials, who are now, of course, in their 40s, the millennials over the last 10 or 15 years have left the suburbs, left their parents' houses, left their parents' idea of how to live, and moved back to small apartments, often condominiums, in cities, and have lived urban lives. We see how far that goes once they have children. Not that they can't live in the city with children, but the condominiums that have been built over the last 20 years in many cities are too small. They're just built for one person or two people. And there are no schools, and there are no places where you can go with your children. So we have to see how that develops. And of course, the main argument, also one of my main arguments against the current form of suburbanization, is that climate change lives in suburbia. We're making it there. This is where we make climate change, in suburbia. We have to drive everywhere. We live in much too large houses. In the north, they have to be heated. In the south, like in Perth, Australia, where it's 40 degrees, they have to be cooled. So we use huge amounts of energy to get to those places, to get to the work, to cool and heat those places. So we're producing a lot of greenhouse gases. We're producing the problems that we now have to collectively deal with. So that's the storyline of the suburban crisis. yet it persists. Another picture from Mississauga. We still live in it. And the majority now lives in these kinds of environments. And if we add another 3 billion people to the now, 8 billion that we are, who's counting, but we're adding about 3 billion before it plateaus in the end of the century. That's a prediction. Those 3 billion people will live in environments mostly in the periphery of cities. They're not going to move to the city center necessarily. So we need to think about what that means as we move forward. The models that we're working with are 100 years old. There are two forms, and I already sort of alluded to it. There is classically, architecturally, from a planning point of view, the broadacre city, Frank Lloyd Wright's idea about urbanization and urbanism, and Le Corbusier's unité d'habitation on the right. Right? A dispersed form of peripheral organization and the one on the right, which, of course, the horror image is always that Le Corbusier wanted to tear down Paris and rebuild it with like this. Now, what happened instead was they left Paris and they rebuilt the suburbs of Paris to a large degree like what you see on the right. And in many European countries and in many Latin American countries, in Canada, you see the form on the right now predominant. And of course, even more so, as you will see in a minute, in certain parts of Asia. But first, let's go to the origin of one of the models. That's Falling Water, a house that Frank Lloyd Wright, the American architect, built for a rich businessman outside of Pittsburgh. And that is sort of the prototype of the type of suburbanization that we saw in much of the 20th century. But when you leave the area, the museum area where you can, visit this iconic house, you get to the reality of this, which now you find everywhere in the world. This is what came of it. Not many people live in houses like that. But everybody lives in houses like that. So that's the form it took. So this is the mass form of suburbanization coming out of this particular form. But consider scale, right? In the forests of Pennsylvania, it looks kind of nice. But if you go to Los Angeles, it looks like this. So these, again, pictures I took about 3 minutes apart when I flew into Los Angeles International Airport a number of years ago. So on the left, you see the ultimate American model, swimming pools, little houses, bungalows, rectangular streets. And like 2 minutes later, 3 minutes later, you fly over the landscape that supports that other landscape. So that the idea of the single-family home on a plot of land, which has driven suburbanization, particularly in the Anglosphere, that is backed up by this industrial landscape where the trucks are that carry all the stuff into those single-family homes that you see on the left-hand side. And that's also where the jobs are, right? It's because these people who live in these houses have to go to work somewhere. Right? So this is the classical two-sided story of suburbanization that often is not being told, because when we talk about the suburbs, we only talk about the left side of things. And in these Anglo-Saxon models where this is very predominant, Australia, Canada, the United States, also Britain to some degree, these are now joined with immigrant settler imaginaries. And that also, to some degree, of course, counts Brazil or counts South Africa, places like that, where you have some settler colonial history. I'm not saying that Brazil is like the United States, but of course, people have come here over the years to have something they couldn't have where they come from. So when you're Italian and you live in the south of Italy, you come to Toronto, you expect to live in a bungalow that you own. If you come from Hong Kong, you move to Toronto, you expect that you can live on a plot of land like all other North Americans. That's the idea that you have, the American dream, the Canadian dream. And that has driven to some degree and drives this kind of expansion as we move forward. All right, but there is a second storyline. Back to Nova Lima for a minute. But this is only a placeholder because the other storyline starts here in Dessau in Germany, which is the Bauhaus. I showed you Le Corbusier already, but the other storyline starts with this kind of building, large, multi-story types of buildings developed 100 years ago in the 1920s, not in the 2020s. And they immediately were successful as a form of housing and office buildings, of course, around the world. This is in my hometown where I was born, in Frankfurt in Germany, built in the 1920s, a model suburb at the time. They went out of the medieval core of Frankfurt and built these types of this looks empty and odd and not very pleasant, but it's now one of the most beautiful neighborhoods these are the most beautiful neighborhoods in Frankfurt. They're most sought after neighborhoods. Families hold on to these places. They give them to family members when they get older because nobody wants to give up this kind of housing, a very successful modernist form of housing, which North Americans don't know that much in other parts of the world. But here it is very successful. But it also has that other side to it, which is often associated with the former East, or geographically still the East, but the Soviet sphere of influence, where after 1945, particularly in the 70s and 80s of the last century, these kinds of buildings were built in large settlement structures. This is Tallinn in Estonia. But you find that in East Berlin, you find it in Prague, you find it in all major Eastern European countries, but you also, as I already said, you find it in Paris, you find it in Western cities, in Glasgow and in formerly West Germany. So it's not unique to the East, but it is the extension of this kind of expansion. And today, we are on a hyper development of this kind of peripheral urbanization, particularly in countries where you have states developing these kinds of estates, in places like Singapore, or as you can see here in Turkey and in China, but also in many other parts of the world. And this is state-driven, often financed by state capital, but also often by international capital. And this is now, I would guess, I don't have the numbers, but I would guess from what I have seen, probably the form of housing in the periphery of cities that houses most people around the world and will house most people around the world, together, of course, with informal settlements that you also see. Here's another example in Gurgaon outside of Delhi in India, where you see this kind of development. And here on the left, this is in Barra de Tijuca, outside of Rio. And which is in the back you see, I think these buildings were built for the Pan Am Games, like 12 years ago, whatever that was. And there's a favela in front of it, but I'm standing on the 12th or 14th floor of a gated community that was just under development, and I pretended with my wife that I was going to move from Toronto to Rio and I wanted to buy an apartment there. So we looked at those and pretended, and which is not, I'm not saying this is a good research method, but I was not in official mission. I was a tourist. So you see all three forms: informal settlement, private condominium development in a gated community, and publicly financed suburbanization, peripheral urbanization on the left. On the right, again, the typical Turkish form of urbanization now that is outside of Istanbul. And all of these forms of suburbanization now have distinctive forms of suburban ways of life. As extremes, you can say these two make a good case. On the left, you see a roadside stand outside of an old township development in Johannesburg, outside of Johannesburg, South Africa. And on the right, you see a typical Canadian suburb with all the fixings, McDonald's, a water tower. You'll find that everywhere around. So you have a highway, fast food restaurants, these kinds of things. They come, with as they support that particular suburban way of life, just as the roadside stand on the left supports another peripheral form of life. All right, so I said before, this kind of peripheral development also produces new centralities. This is one of them. This is the university where I work, out of my former office, 7th floor of a high-rise building. And this is a subway station, which was built only in the last decade. And the tower is very far in the back that you see in the mist there is the downtown. So it's about 25 kilometers away from the downtown, still in the city of Toronto. And this has become, not only because of the subway, but also because of the 60,000 students at that university, a new form of centrality. And around that centrality, now you have new forms of peripheral urbanization happening, which is, education now is a driver of these kinds of developments. And just north, 5 kilometers north of there, where at the end of the subway line, you have what they call a new city center, which of course is nothing like a city center. It's just a suburban agglomeration of high-rise buildings on top of a subway station and a mall. And so there is apartments, commercial developments, offices that are now developed around this area. So, but peripheral centrality is a term that I'm currently doing quite a bit of work on. And I think that's something that we need to think about over the next 25 or 50 years as being a determinant form. And João told me that in Nova Lima there are some developments like this that I'm hoping to see in the next few days. The interesting thing, again, coming back one more time to this, my global trip around Suburbia, is that there's this interreferencing going on now. You have, you don't quite know where things are coming from, the ideas for particular forms. We know that the bungalow, the North American forms of housing, is actually something that the North Americans got from British colonialism in India, who stole it and introduced it to England and then put it into all over Australia and America. But here also you see these types of developments on the left, a Turkish development on the European side of Istanbul. And this follows, you don't know whether they got the ideas from China or China gets the ideas from Turkey, or do they get the ideas from the banlieue of Paris. So there's sort of a development that it's not quite clear where the origins are. And it's sort of a global development, but it also references it. The one in the middle is really interesting because it is built by a German architect outside of Shanghai in a city called Anting, which is the place where, until the pandemic, VW produced more cars than in Germany. That looks exactly like the town where my in-laws live in Germany, in Nuremberg. It's the same scale, but the reference point is a German town, but it's in the center of China somewhere, right? So you have German towns in China, and now you have the Chinese development model has just changed. The Chinese government, or those people who deal with these kinds of things, have given out new ideas about not to build that thing on the left anymore, that's in Turkey, but it could also be in China, but to develop a different kind of urbanism that looks more like the Netherlands and less like China. So these models are now being pushed back and forth, kicked back and forth, and you can see, and this is obviously a quote from Twitter, social media plays a role in promulgating these kinds of developments now as a global phenomenon. All right, so now we have a choice. I have no idea, because I didn't look at the time, how we're doing with the time. I can end it here and open it up for questions, or I can take you through a case study of Toronto. Up to you. Yeah? Good. Could I ask you to grab the bottle for me quickly? Because I'm... Okay, so Toronto is the place where I live. The city has 3 million people. I think it's somewhere on the floor there. Yes, thanks. Thank you very much. Toronto is a city of 3 million people, but in a region of about 8 million people. And this is the map, and you see the gray area. This is the lake, one of the Great Lakes in North America. And the gray shaded area is settled. The white is mostly open for development, and the green is a green belt, where currently, on current legislation, you cannot build. So what you have now is a run to develop a lot of the white belt between the gray and the green, but also there's a lot of what they call leapfrogging beyond the green belt, where now communities beyond the protected areas are now getting a lot of development. It causes a lot of controversy, as you can imagine, because it creates actually more traffic rather than less traffic over time. So that's the map. Here is a political version of this map, and I'm referring here in this case study that I'm going to show you, and this is about mostly about the last few years and the pandemic experience, what I'm going to talk about, to work that I've done with my colleague Murat Uçoğlu, who works also at my university, and we've done a couple of studies on the development of these suburban land markets during the pandemic. And to see, and that again goes to the topic of this talk, which is about after suburbia. Now that we live in it, how do we deal with it? It is important to know, this is now the slice of that map that is just the city of Toronto. 3 million people. And when we say the suburbs, the ones you see, so this is Toronto, right? That's the map I'm going to show you in the next slide. So the suburban areas around here, when you hear the word suburb here, you would again think these are the less dense single-family home type neighborhoods. And the area in the middle is the old city of Toronto. There must be more density. But in reality, if you look at the map of the city of Toronto, all the areas that are yellow, which we call the yellow belt, are zoned for single-family housing. You can't build anything outside of a single-family house by law, by right. You can't just tear something down and build an apartment building. Right? And there's a huge controversy around what that means, because 500,000 people are coming to Canada each year, and 300,000 of those 500,000 come to the Toronto area. So they must live somewhere. And we can't keep on sprawling. So one of the questions now is how you develop an inner city that is already, that looks suburban to most people in the world. It doesn't look like downtown Belo Horizonte at all. Right? It's very suburban in many ways. How do you create more density in the existing urban fabric? But I'm not going to talk about that today. I just wanted to let you know that when we say suburban in Toronto, it may be something that we're not expecting. The other thing is that I said earlier that when we say the word suburb, people tend to believe it's only about residential development. It's only about housing. But in reality, a lot of the suburban development is driven by business. It's driven by workplaces. So these are some of the suburban mega zones and knowledge-intensive districts, not my terms, kids, but Pamela Blay of the Neptus Foundation came up with this excellent acronyms, kids. These are areas like I showed you earlier, York University, around here. Here's the airport area. Of course, the downtown is a workplace and knowledge-intensive area. But you also have places like here in suburban Markham, in Vaughan, and elsewhere outside of this map, where you have concentrations of workplaces that drive suburbanization. Very important to remember that. So these are the western suburbs of Toronto. These are three. The northernmost here at the top we can disregard. It's a mostly rural area which is just beginning to urbanize. But the other two are the city of Mississauga, which I've referenced a number of times. And for the rest of what I'm going to say, I'm going to concentrate mostly on the thing in the middle, which is called Brampton, a city now of 700,000 people, to the west of Toronto. But again, as a reminder, this is what it looks like in Mississauga. But come to Brampton with me. I show you yet another type of urbanization. You see the slab concrete buildings also, which house about 50% of the population of Toronto, the city, but also increasingly more people in the suburbs of Toronto. This is taken from the parking lot of a shopping mall. So again, the point I'm making is that the suburbs don't just come as a residential area. They always come as a package with an infrastructure that is suburban and automobile-oriented. And here you see the red dot here is the city of Brampton. And you see how well connected it is to the airport, but also the highways. And what it doesn't show is also the railways that make Brampton the center of the e-commerce economy in Toronto. Warehouse and warehouse and warehouse after warehouse became as I already said, a hotspot of the COVID dynamic, and I'm going to talk about that next week. But for the purposes of today, here are the numbers to show you the explosive growth of this kind of suburb. So in 1971, only 41,000 people lived there. Now, 800,000 people live there. Between 2011 and 2023, 35% increase of population in that town. 800,000 people. I was born in the city of Frankfurt, which has 750,000 people now. When I left 30 years ago, it had much less. It's now growing again in terms of population. But the city of Frankfurt looks much different because it's grown as a medieval city than this city. And that city, the identity of that city continues to be that of a suburban community. It's very difficult to break that pattern. That for terms of governance, in terms of infrastructure, they're just now getting rail transit there because people are automobile oriented. It's very difficult to sell urban infrastructures in these environments. But nonetheless, they have made a huge step forward. And, oh no, I should say, forgot to talk about that. Those kinds of communities, Mississauga, Brampton, Markham, those kinds of communities around Toronto are now much, much, much more diverse than the city of Toronto itself. The majority of those neighborhoods, those towns and cities are non-white. The majority are very mixed, not only non-white, but also very mixed in origin from around the world, which is because the majority of immigrants to Canada don't move to the center city anymore as they did 100 years ago. New York, right, was the ultimate immigrant city. Downtown Toronto, Italians, Jews, later Chinese Chinatowns, a typical example of that. Now, the Chinatowns are in the suburbs. Right? In Mississauga and in Brampton, the majority of the population are South Asian. So you have a completely different population, a new population, a very young population, a population with ambition, and a population that have no memory and history of the Anglo-American suburb that I talked about half an hour ago, right? It's a completely different idea about what it means to live in the periphery of Toronto than the Anglo settlers that came there 40, 50 years ago. And even different from, let's say, the Italians who came in the 1950s as construction workers and then moved to the suburbs. The Portuguese, who came from the Azores mostly and moved to Toronto and then out to the suburbs. Now we have Chinese, South Asian immigrants to immediately move to these kinds of environments. And here you now have an awakening of sorts where the people who live in these suburbs want to know where this is going because they know the kind of suburban environments in which they live are not sustainable. Economically, now we had a health crisis. Economically, it's difficult. From a health point of view, it's difficult. Sustainability-wise, it's difficult. And they have now created a process of a plan that takes them, let's say, first to 2040. It's called Vision Plan 2040. In that plan, they formulated as a philosophical statement, the essence of Brampton is diversity, and the essence of what the people want for the future is that their city be arranged, governed, seen, and celebrated as a mosaic of people. Not one Anglo-American vision, a mosaic of people, places and endeavors of all kinds coexisting in harmony. Living the mosaic in 2040 is a central and simple aspiration of the people of Brampton. So there is an aspiration there to do something in that suburban environment that hasn't been done. Because in the center city where the immigrants moved for 150 years, people moved out of those central cities and left it to other immigrants. But those immigrants are here to stay. They're not going to move anywhere from there. So they want to create communities of a kind that has never existed before in the history of humanity. Right? They think consciously about that under the challenges of climate change. So this may not be very attractive, but these are the kinds of images that are now being produced. What you see at the outset, again, is the combination of this low-rise, low-density, and high-rise, high-density type of environment. But it's also, you see here, a greening. You see sports facilities, cricket fields and baseball fields and soccer pitches. You know that I can say that here in Brazil because you may not think of Canada as a soccer nation, and we didn't do so well in the World Cup. But a good third, up to half of our national team comes from this community of Brampton. And they're all immigrant kids, Colombian, from the Caribbean, Africa. It's the kind of people like, Alfonso Davies, who doesn't come from there, but it's his generation of people who've become global, Jonathan David, global, who is from there, global superstars in football, play in France or in Germany, together with your best players, right? And they come from these kinds of environments. There is aspiration in these communities. There's a forward-looking idea about where this is going to go, right? These are not the eternal suburbs that you see on American television. That's a new form of urbanization. And I make the case here for Toronto, but I can also make the case for the suburbs of Istanbul or Shanghai or other places in the world where you have that similar kind of ambition as we move forward. Anyway, it's a plan. We have no idea. I don't know what's going to happen in 2040. But let's look at the present. So one of the things that happened is that despite the dynamic of this development, we have a huge housing crisis. I mentioned the numbers. 500,000 new immigrants, but also constant growth of the population. Canada is exploding in terms of population numbers. We're a small country by population, only 38 million people, large in area. But we have a housing crisis. And in the housing crisis, during the COVID pandemic, the housing crisis became particularly pronounced because many people were trying to leave the inner city and they were looking for suburban housing. So where there was a suburban housing crisis, it became a suburban housing crisis that was more pronounced. So we looked at the relationship of the pandemic and that. And what we came up with is that, yes, the pandemic played a certain role in producing a housing crisis because there was more demand for housing in the periphery. But in reality, and this is partly based on the PhD dissertation of my colleague Murat Çolu, we came to the conclusion that there is something we can call the suburban financial nexus. That it isn't just that we are producing and making more suburban space at the periphery of cities, but that has become the major growth model of the Ontario economy. Ontario is the province in which Toronto is. the Toronto region is in the province of Toronto, of Ontario. That province's growth model has now for a generation been built on this suburban financial nexus, which is the connection of a particular form of city building or suburb building with global financial markets. And the consequence of that is dramatic. And I'll go through this quickly. Right? It's an economic growth model which is based on extensive construction of suburban housing, massive infrastructure projects, including the ever-growing airport in the suburb, and the connection of suburban land development to the global financial markets. Right? And what that means to the people living in a place like Brampton and Mississauga, you can see here that 79% of people, families, households who live in Brampton have a housing debt. They owe money to the bank because they live in these suburban apartments and these suburban single-family homes. So they're tied to that economic model. And at the same time as they're tied to that model and housing is being built to satisfy the churning of this financial model, financial nexus, a housing crisis is not resolved. More and more people are coming, and it's not a model that can sustainably satisfy the need that is produced in a region such as Toronto. And that, of course, creates a huge precarity because you need not just one job, but often 3 or 4 jobs in the family to satisfy that. People need to make money. Also, people need to have 3 or 4 cars in a house, right? Because they need to get to the jobs. Or they need to drive an Uber, or they drive a truck, right? All of those things are now part of that financial model, that economic model. So the immigrant communities that have moved to these kinds of neighborhoods, they are at the spearhead of the new global economy, the Amazon warehouses, the development industry, that kind of thing, which drives that. They live this kind of life in the suburbs. So it's not an idyllic life, barbecuing sausages in your front yard. That's not the idea. No, you have a truck in your front yard because you have to go to work with it. And you have to pay off the mortgages. Mortgage is a housing debt that you have. You take money from the bank to pay for the house that you buy. Right? It's a dramatic change. So something that the outcome of this is to understand that in the end, the suburbs that we live in today, these housing areas that we live in today, these production zones that are being created, the warehouse zones that are being built, the infrastructures that are built, they're not built for use value. They're not built for people to live. They are built as the ultimate capitalist commodity. Right? It's made to profit. On the left, one last image from Canada. This is Montreal. The kind of houses that are now being built in much of the periphery of Canadian cities. The one on the right, I think, is in South Africa to show you again how, pervasive this kind of model is. But around the world, whether it's Turkey or China or Canada or maybe Brazil, those kinds of places are built for profit. So the dynamic, which I introduced in the beginning as a demographic dynamic, as a cultural dynamic, as a dynamic of housing development and commercial development, in the end boils down, and I hope I was able to show that through this case study of Toronto, because this is an economic growth model that is driving now much of the global economy and drives material flows, supply chains, information economies, of course, again, the e-commerce economy at the center of it, but also, and that's what I mentioned earlier, the location of York University, my university, at the periphery of cities, knowledge production, university education is now increasingly taking place in this kind of environment. That's the world in which we live. So it is the urban world, it's the reality in which we live. So when I said earlier that the suburbs are in crisis and planners and urbanists would like to wish away suburbanization, it's not going to go away. Whether you like it or not, it's the world in which we live, and it's the world in which we have to make a life, which means that we have to think ahead. And I'm going to talk about that and what that means for the environment on, I think, next Thursday. I'm going to talk about the pandemic crisis on Tuesday and how it relates to these kinds of developments. So if you're interested, come back. Open for questions.
Thank you, Roger. We open for questions, doubts, or just like to, yeah, come over and... Ou fazer em português. Português a gente ajuda.
Hello, I'm a master's student here. So you mentioned that we are witnessing a new phenomena in which suburban developments are happening not just around major metropolitan areas, but in random places where you have some type of new economic activity. Like in Uganda, there was a road that was built. And my question is, how do we know that that is a suburban development and not sort of like the early stages of urbanization? That's not like the birth of a new city in just a suburban development?
Well, I would say, I would not say it's not possible that this becomes a new city. I mean, most cities started as suburbs. But it's always a bit difficult to think in biographic terms, like, you know, it's a young city, then it's a teenager city, a juvenile city, and then it becomes a senior city, and then a mature city. I kind of don't like to talk in these kinds of terms. But one thing is for sure, I mean, there are places that look like a dispersed form of settlement today, and they might develop into what you would recognize as a town at some point. There's a church in the middle, or a temple, or a mosque, or something, and a marketplace, and a bus stop, where or a train station, and then you have something that looks eventually like a city. But remember that those kinds of cities that developed those kinds of centralities were built on different technologies than the ones that we have now, which is the point I made at the end, is that it's difficult to imagine, when let's say, France is always a good example. France developed a system of railways in the 19th and 20th century, and every place there was a railway hub, there was one of those towns that developed. So when you drive to France today or take the train to France, you come from one such town. Or England has market towns that were developed at a pre-industrial time that reflect in the way their centrality is produced a pre-industrial form of mobility. The farmers came on a Sunday or a Saturday and sold their stuff in the marketplace, and they went out of a beer in the pub, and then on Sunday morning went to the church, and then they went back home to their farm. So this was a particular form of centrality and dispersal. In today's technological world, that is not going to be replicated as easily. We will have other forms, that's why I keep on talking about new forms of centrality. But we're not going to, it's unlikely that these new forms of urbanization are going to produce another Paris or London or, that kind of a centrality. It is, and, it's very difficult to imagine that this kind of a form will come out of the mix of technology and urbanization that we see today. But that doesn't mean that I'm saying no centrality will exist, quite to the contrary. I said the university is a center. The airport may be a center. Now, before the pandemic, at one point, more people worked at the airport in Toronto than in the financial district downtown. And Toronto's financial district is extremely important because it finances most mining, it's important to this city. Toronto is a financial center for the mining industry, right? So I'm sure a lot of people here, when they want money for mining, they go to Toronto to raise the money. That's a particular kind of centrality that people understand about the center of Toronto. But at some point, 10 years ago, more people worked at the airport, which is not in the center of the city, than there. You can already see that the idea of what centrality means has changed in that context. But you are right. I'm not excluding the possibility that new places will come and old places will go. Old centers will disappear. But it is as an overall relationship of periphery and centrality, things have changed.
My name is Clemens. I'm a professor here in the Geographical Institute. I need some clarification about concepts because I studied suburbanization in the 1980s, and afterwards I didn't think about these classifications. What I saw from your photographs was these are planned areas of single family houses, which might be urban, suburban, some kind of sleep cities where people only sleeping and living, and all the other social functions are they do in another area in the city center, something like that. And the other model is this kind of social housing. We know it from Germany in Emmertsgrund, in Heidelberg, Vogelstang in Mannheim, Gropiusstadt in Berlin, which are planned cities for workers, for socially marginalized people. Like here in Brazil, we have the Minha Casa, Minha Vida project, which are doing the same thing. Something like that. So this would be also a suburban area. And we have these commercial and industrial centers in the peripheries of cities, which are also suburban areas. Is it like that, to define it? Because I try to localize what are favelas. Where are the favelas? Are these suburban areas or not? Because it's very interesting here in Belo Horizonte, which is a planned city, which was already planned with city functions, with a commercial center in the inner city. We have an industrial district in Contagem, and we have also suburban areas which had been planned from the beginning. We have a quarter charmed Funcionarios, for example, it was already planned like that. And Brazil, it's the same way. We have sleep cities already planned since the beginning. So it's not, my way, not simply a suburban area. It was a result of planning. This I wanted to know, and Belo Horizonte, the growth of Belo Horizonte was mainly occurred through the vilas, favelas, which are informal settlements, which became afterwards formalized and got city functions and new centralities. It's interesting enough that you can, in favelas, you are obliged to realize your life in the neighborhood, and many people their living, their space of living is also the space of work with informal activities and something like that. So we have a lot of centrality in the favelas, in spite we wouldn't expect it. And we have always also investment in the favelas, which are aggregating new centralities to these areas. We have, for example, a shopping center in Venda Nova, which was an area of periphery, which got an update somehow. These are some problems which I try to clarify to find names for these different areas. And the other question I have is a provocation. The pandemic and the COVID during the we organized also teaching online. We gave classes. I formed master students without seeing them personally, and something like that. And this opened up new possibilities to think urban life. And I would provoke, do we need cities anymore when we have these possibilities of insertion in global flows of commercial flows, even in the most remote areas? Something like that.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Yeah, I can. I was the director of a research program that was called Global Suburbanisms. So for many years, I didn't move away from the concept of suburbanisms, and we'd use the plural. I would say it's not one way of life, but it's many. But I never talked about suburbs. I only talked about suburbanization and suburbanisms as very high-level concepts that include many of the things that you were talking about. But because I was the director of the project, I couldn't start in the middle of the project renaming the project into, it's not about suburbanization, it's not about suburbs, because sometimes that language doesn't fit. So as we were moving out of this project, and I sort of could speak beyond it, I published this book on the suburban planet, right? I had to get the name in, and there was a lot of talk about planetary urbanization. And a lot of people, when they said planetary urbanization, a lot of people, when they read this, they thought it included a lot of the things that you mentioned, but they weren't specific either. They didn't say, oh, this is the stuff that happens. It's now, my friends and colleagues, like Christian Schmidt and Neil Brenner and others are developing, and Roberto Montemor here, and João and Rodrigo Castriota are bringing nuance to this idea of what planetary urbanization is. But I stuck to this idea of suburbanization to just make that counterpoint, is that when I speak in front of an audience or I talk to my students, I want to make sure that they hear the sub. They hear the idea that a lot of the things that are happening now are not urbanization in the old, modality of urbanization. So the sub is, on my side, a provocation to say, hear it, see it somewhere else. It looks different, it feels different. It's driven by different processes. Suburban financial nexus. Right? It has a political economy, it has an economic, a market, an economy, a market that is different. It has labor markets that are different and specific, and it has forms and it has forms of sociality. And some of them are informal, like in the favelas, and some of them are formal, like in the Chinese subdivisions that are rolling out over the Chinese landscape to house millions and millions and millions of people. Very huge spectrum of those kinds of things. The important common nenner of all of, I'm beginning to speak German too. The common denominator of all of those is that they are an expansion of the area of the city and the population of the city and the economic activity in the peripheral areas of those cities. And then we have to look at all those things that you mentioned to see, how is this different? How is Addis Ababa different from Johannesburg? How is Paris different from Berlin? For various different historical reasons, right? Because Berlin was a city that had a wall around it and had limits to how it could grow. And after 1989, all of a sudden something else happened, but Paris had already developed this. London had a green belt. So just look at these three cities and what suburbanization means in these three European cities. It's completely different. And we talked on the way here about Colombian cities. Very different. The 3 or 4 large Colombian cities are all very different. The 3 or 4 large Canadian cities, all very different in the way they grow, in the way the suburbs grow, and in the way suburbanization is defined. So it is an open question, and I will not claim, and I have never claimed, that the concept of suburbanization covers all of it neatly all the time. I would never say that. But it's an opening concept by which I can say, I can ask those kinds of questions and find some answers. You know, we have done work for 10 years on this, so I have some answers that I didn't have 10 years ago because I worked on it incessantly, obsessively about that. The second question you raised, I'm totally in agreement with you. This is a huge challenge. I have no answer. I don't know what's going on. I'm at a suburban university. I'm often, when I'm at work, I'm the only one there. There's nobody there. The students come to class, they go home. When I go to my dentist, who is on the 15th story on a high-rise building in downtown Toronto, I look at the high-rise building across the street, and I go to the dentist every quarter year or so, like every 3 months. Every time I go there, there's nobody in the other building, right? It's an office building. There are computers in this office building. This is for 3 years. And I asked my dentist, I say, are these people not coming back? She said, no, I'm not ever seeing anyone in this building. 40% of Toronto's downtown is empty. Right? It's not only the offices are empty, the stores are closed. Right? New York, Toronto. Now they're talking about creating residential units in those office buildings, which is very difficult because they were not built for that use. So their architects are scratching their heads how to do this. But for the suburbs, it is an opportunity, for the classical suburbs, the automobile suburbs, because if you have moved your work life from the downtown to where you live in the suburbs, in that classical model, a cafe can open now because you're not downtown anymore when you want a break. So you leave your house, you leave your computer, you take your dog for a walk, and you go down the street, and you sit down for a coffee. So all of a sudden, there's an incentive to create new types of suburban spaces that we thought were urban spaces, right? So it's open. I have no answer to that. I'm asking the same kinds of questions. And I am more pessimistic than most people, personally, about places like downtowns, because they're awful places, too. They're corporate, they're consumer-oriented, and tourism-oriented, of course, right? People come from other places, and all they see is the downtown. People visit Toronto, and they never get out of the downtown core. I never go to the downtown core. And I don't have nothing to do except I go to my dentist. I work in the suburbs. I live in a peripheral neighborhood, not in the suburbs, but I have no reason to go downtown. I'm too old to go to the bars on a regular basis. Like, don't go clubbing. It's like, what is there for me to do downtown? I can go to the opera, to the theater, to the museum. Took my granddaughter to, an aquarium the other day. But that's it. So I behave like a tourist in my own town, right? I don't work there. I don't live there. So a lot of people are like me, and a lot of people have become more like that through the pandemic, and we have to see what the consequence of that is going to be as we move forward. A lot of that has to do, in my view, with it's partly a sub-answer to the last question, is how centralities are being produced now, the question how e-mobility is going to work out. Because if we have more access to more individualized electric mobility, and you can feel good about driving, then maybe you decide to even move to a smaller town, farther away from Belo Horizonte, or farther away from Toronto, and farther away from New York, because you can. Because it doesn't cost you anything, it doesn't cost the environment anything of you driving more. Right? Today, we're being asked not to move to those places because with a gas-powered car, a petrol-powered car, you are a destroyer of the environment. But once you have your Tesla in use, what stops you from moving anywhere? Importantly, again, centrality and the question about what's going to happen now. What's going to happen to the public transportation systems? Right? Also, our subway is only half full. I get a seat every morning when I go to work, if I go to work. Right? There's no problem. There's nobody standing next to me. People are still, it's empty. Right? The streetcars, on the other hand, have become, places where homeless, houseless people now ride back and forth. Toronto is a very cold city. A streetcar is a warm place. So the defunding of social services in a neoliberal city has now led to the fact that the public transportation system becomes one of the places where the future of collective urbanity is being fought over. You saw that horrible event in New York City on the news in the last few days, right, where a guy got killed by another passenger for behaving unruly. Terrible, terrible murder of another human being. And these kinds of conflicts you now see in these emptied out cities where people can't make a life anymore. The economies have dissipated and disappeared. And it's not easy for people to survive in these marginal types of economic spaces anymore. It's not all that horrible. There are some really wonderful things happening in these towns.
Still have time?
No, I have 5-10 minutes.
So if no one else wants to join in, I'll ask you questions. So thanks very much, Roger, for this very thought-provoking suburban voyage. And yesterday, we had a very lively discussion in our course on urban political economy. Some of students are here, and we were discussing planetary urbanization, extended urbanization, and what happens with what's out there, with the rural, with the indigenous communities, with what's not considered completely urbanized yet. When they are reached by this sprawling, extended suburban forms of urbanization. And especially in the Brazilian case, we were discussing the agrarian question because it touches on the question of land. As you finished with that, I just wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on this, on what happens when suburbanizations meet something else that has, of course, already been there, sometimes for many centuries, and how this also can create differential forms of urbanization.
Yeah, I think not having been part of your discussion yesterday, I think there are at least two main questions involved here. One is the relationship with the city and the countryside. And the other one is very typical for the countries where we live, in Brazil or in Canada, which is the question of settler societies and the question of indigenous land and non-indigenous land and land claims and all of that. And so in the first instance, the tendency has been there for a while that for agriculture, of course, to remain important, but to be mechanized and concentrated. That is true for Canada, it's true for Brazil, true for the European Union. Right? Ever larger conglomerates of agricultural production. There are some counter developments. I just heard on a radio program last week, and I don't have the details, but I'm going to follow up on it, is that in Quebec, which is a province of Canada, young people are the driving force behind organic farming. And there are now 30,000 organic farms in the province of Quebec, which has about 6 million people. That's a sizable number of young people who are moving to the countryside to create something else. And so they are, but in the main, not only is agriculture becoming, or is an industry, and in many cases, again, like in Canada with its wheat, and here with your soybeans and all manner of things, it's part of a global economy. You export it to China or to Europe or wherever. And you see that subtext around Ukraine war. It's all about wheat. It's all about, feeding the world. So agriculture is like that. And we know that, and it's part of a capitalist world market. And it isn't much different from it's not non-capitalist, right? So the old idea that the city is capitalist and what's outside is not, doesn't apply to most places. I mean, there are arguments to be made about India, for example, where there is probably some, stark difference between a majority of rural economies and the incredible urbanizing areas that India, now the most populous country in the world, is developing also. I think there is, and Ananya Roy and others have made that point. But in most other places in the world, it's not a systemic difference whether you live in the city or in the countryside. And there's wage labor in the countryside, there's capitalism, there is investment in the countryside. All of those things also exist there. From an economic point of view, from the point of view of political economy, there's little difference. And today, the place, own a cottage in the countryside, 3 hours north of Toronto, whenever a house is built in that rural community, it'll have all the things in the house that you also find in the city. Television, computer, internet. There will be 1 or 2 cars in front of those places. So there is no real difference anymore between the city and the countryside. So in that sense, I think it's important to demystify this relationship. But it's also important, and that goes back to those 30,000 young Quebec organic farmers, is that a new group of people are seeking to live different kinds of lives in both the city and the countryside. And some people have been pushed out of the city into those neighborhoods, because a lot of people leave the city because they can't pay for the rent anymore. So they end up in these marginal little towns outside of big cities, and they try to make a living there. It's very difficult if you're a young couple, you have children, there's no daycare, there are no services, there is no family doctor, right? So rural life may be not systemically different, but it doesn't offer you the same kinds of amenities outside of the house when you leave the television screen and the internet. You don't have the same sort of things in the community. And there's a lot there that could be developed, that these places become more urban in a way. On the other end of things, we need to think differently about suburban areas today. Instead of having green lawns in the suburbs, let's make them little fields of growing stuff, urban agriculture as suburban agriculture. If the majority of us live in between the city and the countryside, as I've argued, then we can only find a solution to climate change, or the climate challenge, the climate emergency, if we do something about that space in between, those suburban areas that are so hostile to environmental matters and are hostile to human survival. Too much asphalt, too many streets. So let's think differently about city and countryside as something altogether new and different. So that would be my way forward. And there are some Australian scholars that develop in that. And again, I don't want to talk about in installments, but I'm going to talk about some of that on next Thursday. But the other question is very difficult to answer. And I'm not sure whether you asked me that question, but when I hear you ask that question, I hear that. Because if we now, and it goes back to the question of the mines, if we go to places like Fort McMurray in the north of Alberta, a colleague, Rob Shields, has called that feral, wild suburbanization. So they're building these suburban environments directly into the indigenous communities. And not only into the indigenous communities that are there, but also into landscapes that are claimed by indigenous communities as being whole and environmentally sustainable. If you have an oil field in that landscape and a suburb to support the working people in that oil field, you're creating a completely different relationship between the city and the countryside, and between the settler economy and the indigenous economies that exist there. And that has to be resolved. It has to be resolved in Brazil. You know, I just went on my way coming in, I saw the news about Lula making contracts now with indigenous communities in this country. We have that all the time, constantly. This is the number one topic in many land relationships in Canada right now, is about how do we deal with this. But we also need to understand, and Australia is a little bit ahead of Canada in this, I don't know about Brazil, but one of the things we need to understand is that indigeneity, that countryside, the non-urban, isn't just found outside of the classical city. But you also need to understand that we are, by definition, on native land. And if this event had been held in Canada, or in Australia, we begin every event now with a land acknowledgement. Because I just assumed, even though you've had a longer history of colonization than Canada, I assume that this is indigenous land in some way or another, right? You know, the first picture I took yesterday is Belo Horizonte on native land. So this is a thing we need to resolve, because we can't by definition claim that we are in the city and then there are some indigenous people outside, right, with whom we are now making contracts. No, we're already on their land. So what does that mean? Because maybe the indigenous peoples who have lived here for longer than us settlers, and I'm saying that as an immigrant from Germany to North America, right? So I am an immigrant settler, so I can speak about myself. And a lot of people in Canada are like me. I'm assuming a lot of people are here in Brazil are like me. We are on indigenous land. So how do we move forward? Climate change, pandemics, Zika, dengue fever. You know, how do we deal with these things? Are we going to go back to the modern ways of the 20th century and just look at how the city and progress and modernity are one package? No, we can't, because this has gotten us into a lot of problems. So when we want to reconcile the city and the countryside, we need to reconcile some of those differences in those worlds that have been kept apart, because what we have been told and what we have been telling ourselves is that we are modern in the city and we know how things are done, and then there are some backward people outside, whether they're farmers and peasants, in that sense backward because they're of a backward economy, not industrial, not computerized, not digitized, and all of that, or they're indigenous and they are from a different era altogether. They are not modern in that sense. No, we can't do that anymore. We can't do it ethically, and we can not do it because we're endangering our own survival in these communities. So now what's happening in Vancouver, for example, large Canadian city, we have a lot of pressure in some of the indigenous lands. Now indigenous urbanists, indigenous entrepreneurs developed ideas about how to develop certain parts of Vancouver in ways that are compatible, not just with the building codes of the city of Vancouver, but also with the ideas of indigenous people, how to live on the land, right? That's, I think, one reconciliation of the city and the countryside in that sense. So I don't know whether I answered your questions, but this is what I heard you ask me, and we can continue that conversation later.
One more, Clemens, and we finish. You want to? No. Please. Microphone.
Yeah, I agree partly with your comments, and I just want to as a political ecologist, have a little critics about this idea of planetary urbanization, this theorization, which is common here in the areas of planning, which are neglecting the non-urban territories and something like that. So we are in a risk that we are forgetting that as a fight for territories in Brazil is caused by a political option. It's not like that planetary urbanization already took over. This is, if it would be like that, we wouldn't have these terrible conflicts in the Yanomami land, for example, but also here in around Belo Horizonte, where we have the invasion of Quilombola land and something like that. And so I just wanted to, I define the difference not between city and countryside. We have, I try to discuss the territorial metabolism of urban lifestyle. And you said that modern agriculture for me is urban, it's not rural. It's a logic of in industry. It's not a logical of autonomous life of rural people, non-urban people. It's a logic of market, of specialization, of subordination of landscapes for one market product. It might be hydroelectric dams, it might be mining, it might be forestry, forest monocultures, or soybeans. This is part of the urbanization. It's not a countryside on my vision, because I'm working with rural people which are not living like that. They're living from the ecosystem, what offers the ecosystem on the local area where they're living within. And we have a conflict between this territorial metabolism of the lifestyles of the livelihoods of the non-urban people, which is very strong here in Brazil. And what I'm seeing within the discussion of planetary urbanization, which I agree as a tendency, is that we are taking it as something given, already done. And we are already taking it as if we're living in one world only. And so we are sort of, in some sense, hiding our own colonial thinking if we are neglecting these other territorialities. Now, planetary urbanization, to make it, to close now the talk, I don't know if I could make me understandable, but planetary urbanization is a political decision. It's not an evolutionary process. And I think we need to stress it if we are trying to defend indigenous people, Quilombolas people, and something like that. And planetary urbanization is the spatial evidence for colonization, and so it is, in my point of view, it's ongoing colonization since 500 years ago, and, which is now going through the technological development to its most modern phase, but the principle is the same, something like that.
Yeah, I totally agree with the spirit of what you're saying. I'm a political ecologist, urban political ecologist myself, but and I leave the defense of planetary urbanization to other people in this room who are more, in that debate. But I want to say that we need to differentiate between an analytical concept called planetary urbanization, which is a theoretical and conceptual idea about what drives the capitalist world and its expansion right now, and the insatiable hunger of the planetary urbanists, the people who actually go out and destroy all those things that you're talking about. These are two totally different things. And my friends and colleagues who've been pushing, is also at this institution, been pushing this idea of planetary urbanization. I mean, Professor Montemor, when I met him in the 1980s in Los Angeles, he told me about a Coca-Cola vending machine he saw in the Amazon, and he said to me, we were outside having a smoke and having a coffee, and he said, "This is the city." And I said, "What are you talking about?" I didn't understand what he was talking about. But 40 years later, I know what he's talking about, because he's absolutely right. And of course, that Coca-Cola vending machine in the Amazon is is a form of urbanization. That's what it is, and it's a more complicated and nuanced discussion that we can have time for right now. But Roberto or Neil Brenner or Christian Schmidt or these people who are the proponents of this, and I see myself partly in the same, like moving that along too. We don't propose that we should do that. We're just saying it is happening. And not to, to pretend that it's not happening and to say, oh, we're just all going to live happily in 15-minute cities and ride around in Dutch bicycles. That's also not going to, which is sort of the counter idea that we live in defined cities and then there's something outside which may be different. So I think we need to keep those two things apart. And you're absolutely right, talk about metabolism, that's the whole thing. But it's more and more difficult to differentiate circles of metabolism that are separated from one another. And for the third time mentioning those 30,000 organic farms, they, to some degree, have separated themselves from the metabolism of oil, which produces the stuff that normally goes into soil, in terms of they're creating a different kind of metabolism in these organic farms. But they can't do without the money economy because they go to Montreal and sell their stuff in Montreal and Quebec City, right? So they can't really be outside of that metabolism of money. And David Harvey and others have talked about this, that it's, it's nothing unnatural about New York City. Because the money, the mining capital in Toronto that puts to work people here in Minas Gerais, and is never separated physically, logically, or in any other way from the metabolisms of the other, right? So that's what I would say.
I'd like to thank Professor Roger for his speech here, his talk here today. It was great to have you here. I think you gave us a lot to think about and to talk about, both in Brazil and also in the rest of the world. Thank all the audience to being here. So thank you once more.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Just thank you again, Roger. And antes da gente ir embora, eu só queria convidar, vocês, os alunos, pesquisadores, professores, para as atividades da semana que vem. Na terça-feira, a gente vai ter o grande seminário do IEAT, sobre doenças infecciosas e urbanização, aqui às 2h30. E na quinta-feira, no auditório do IGC, o professor Roger vai falar sobre ecologia política urbana, um pouco que ele começou aqui no final, a parte da provocação do Clemens, no IGC, no Instituto de Geociências aqui do lado. Tá bem? Muito obrigado pela presença de vocês. Até mais.